In today's video, I'm going to talk about what happens when your camera's light meter, exposure meter, gets things wrong, which can happen quite a lot of the time. This video is part of my Technical Fundamentals course, which week after week builds into an entire basic nuts and bolts photography course of all the technical stuff you'll need to know in order to become a better photographer. I'm sticking videos up every Friday. If you like what you're seeing, hit like, subscribe to get notifications, obviously. And if you've got any questions, please stick them in the comments below. There should be a full transcript for this video appearing on my blog at photosmojo.com fairly soon. But for now, let's find out what happens when exposure meters go wrong. So we've talked about exposure meters, light meters, and we've talked about histograms. So we have an understanding of how the camera arrives at a combination of factors to make an okay exposure. But there's always that question of what's it basing it on? You know, this mythical massive amount of data that was acquired in that lab in Tokyo I talked about, what's it basing it on as being the correct thing? Well, it's calibrated to what's called 18% grey. Now, don't panic, that's not one of the 50 shades of grey, or I don't think it is. It's actually that. That is a grey card, that is 18% grey. And this is what happens if you basically take every tone there is and muddy them together, pretty much. You end up with this 18% grey. Now, that's what your camera's light meter will be calibrated to in order to produce a perfect result. And as we know, a lot of the time it does a perfectly decent job. The problem is when you come across scenes that are particularly far from this 18% grey, then you run into trouble. If the scene you're shooting is particularly far from that neutral 18% grey, your exposure meter is going to get confused. Now, strangely, it gets confused in what I've always thought of as a counterintuitive way. If the scene you're shooting is much, much lighter than the 18% grey, it will try and darken the image, and if it's much, much darker, it will try and lighten the image. Now, I always found this a little bit counterintuitive, but maybe that won't be the case for you. But the logic behind this is that what your camera meter tries to do in choosing an exposure is it tries to bring what it sees in front of it back to that 18% grey. So if the scene you're photographing is very, very dark, it tries to lighten it and bring it back to 18% grey. And if the scene you're photographing is very, very bright, it tries to darken it and bring it back to 18% grey. So what happens is a scene that you were expecting to be dark and moody with lots of deep blacks in ends up looking grey and wishy-washy, and a scene that you were expecting to be bright with lots of clean, pristine whites in it ends up looking grey and wishy-washy. The camera, its meter, and the exposure value it gives you are trying to bring everything back to that 18% grey. Now, the way you get around this problem is firstly to have an understanding of how your camera works, which is what we've been doing in these videos, and then secondly, either use manual exposure mode, which means of course you have got complete control over the choice of exposure you shoot with, or if you're using some sort of automatic exposure mode, you need to use either exposure compensation or automatic exposure lock, both of which I'm about to describe how they work. I'll deal with exposure compensation first. Most cameras will have on them a little button marked with usually a plus minus. That's your exposure compensation button. The way it works is very, very simple. If you are in an automatic exposure mode of some sort, you frame things up, frame the shot you're after, you get a little reading in the viewfinder or on the screen of what the exposure is, and from your knowledge of how light meters work, because this is what we've been learning in this video, of course, we already know how to beat our light meter, you press or hold down the exposure compensation dial. It may vary from camera to camera, you may be able to set them specifically the way you want, and then you dial in as much compensation as you like to make the image lighter or darker. So of course, if you're framing your shot like this and you're looking at what you know is going to be a very, very dark shot, you will take the exposure compensation and you will go negative. You will dial in minus exposure, you will make the image darker. And if you're looking at a scene that's much, much brighter, you're looking at a mountain covered in snow, and you know that the camera is going to try and darken that and bring it back to 18% grey, you take your exposure compensation and you push it towards plus. You dial in more exposure. It's as straightforward as that, really. And now exactly how they work on each camera will vary very slightly, but the plus minus button, the exposure compensation button, allows you to take the exposure that the automatic exposure mode has arrived at and then dial in a certain amount of positive or negative compensation to make the image lighter or darker based on that automatic exposure. Now the other way you can outsmart your camera's light meter if you're shooting in some sort of automatic exposure mode is to use an exposure lock of some sort. This is a very simple button. It might be called AEL or exposure lock on your camera, and it might be that you hold it down or just press it once. What it allows you to do is lock in the exposure value that your meter has given you and then reframe or choose a different shot and keep that same exposure value. One of the most common times you'll find you need to use this is if you're shooting a landscape shot. Now, usually speaking, when you shoot something like a landscape, you will find that the sky is a lot brighter than the ground. That's generally the case. And if you compose your shot with quite a bit of sky in it, the camera's light meter will go, oh, yep, there's lots of light stuff here. I better darken the exposure down. And what you get is a fairly nicely exposed sky, thank you very much, but a very, very dark foreground. The odds are the foreground was what you actually wanted to photograph, particularly if it's got people in it who've just made the effort to climb up a mountain or something. What you would do with an exposure lock is you would frame your shot initially, you would look at the frame you're after, you'd think, right, there's the foreground, there's the people, there's the sky, but then you would reframe until the part of the frame that you want in that final shot is filling the frame, and you'd hold down the exposure lock to basically lock in that exposure. So if it's that landscape, you might fill the frame with just the ground and the grass, lock the exposure in, and then you recompose the shot and shoot. And the exposure that's correct for the grass in this instance should be the exposure that you use. Now what will happen is, of course, the sky will end up being very bright. You won't have much detail left in the sky, but you will have detail in the foreground, in the landscape, in the people you are with, etc., because you've told the exposure meter that that's the bit you want to be locked onto, not the sky, not the bit that it's automatically gone hunting for. Now, of course, just like exposure compensation, exposure lock only counts when you're working in an automatic exposure mode. If you're in manual, you just choose the exposure you want. You don't worry about what the camera tells you. So, that's how your camera's meter gets fooled into under or over exposure. And there are two ways of correcting it if you're using an automatic exposure mode. Don't forget, your camera is always trying to calibrate and neutralize back to this 18% gray. So if your scene is particularly bright, you will need to lighten the exposure. If it's particularly dark, you will need to darken the exposure. And you can do that either with exposure compensation or by using exposure lock to lock in a particular part of the frame and then reframe. That's all for this week. The last little bit coming up with exposure is different exposure modes, which I've been promising for ages. If you like what you're watching, hit like, obviously subscribe for notifications. You know all this, we know how YouTube works. Stick some comments below if I haven't answered a question properly, and I'll do my very best to answer it. Full transcript at my blog at photosmojo.com, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.